Hello and welcome to another video. Hope you're doing absolutely great. Today we have a really fun video in the sense that we're going to take components and use them in very unorthodox ways to create an absolutely delicious dessert. But it's also a very serious video in the sense that it addresses to some extent the relationship between our food and the rest of the world. Now, this video is inspired by a meme that I saw floating around Facebook, basically showing a plate of spaghetti with Nutella on it, and the caption was, "Without objective morality, anything is permitted." Now, I don't know if the meme was intended to be a satire or not. Obviously, trying to make the case for something like objective morality by, for example, trying to make a purely aesthetic argument, which is fundamentally a subjective one, is kind of weird. But there's a serious point as I was thinking about this, and that has to do with why I typically don't use Nutella, and that is palm oil. So, the whole issue with palm oil is a relatively complex issue, okay? And in this segment, I'm going to talk about why I oppose Western import of bulk palm oil for processed foods, and also what Ferrero, the company that makes Nutella, has to say about their practices, and why I don't find that statement very compelling. So, to understand the palm oil issue, you have to look back probably to the 1980s. People were starting to realize that fat in food was possibly linked to heart disease, and so in particular saturated fat. And so a lot of businesses started trying to do things like move away from butter and animal fats to plant fats. And they did this by moving to hydrogenated oils, so vegetable shortening, margarine, those kinds of things. And everybody was happy. They all thought, oh, geez, look, we solved the problem. But along came the 1990s, and basically new research was done, and it found that the trans fats in these particular hydrogenated oils and margarines that they were using were even worse than what they had replaced in the past. So everybody started looking for an alternative. And they went back to using something that had been in use in some cases before, but because now there was like a manufacturing crisis, it became sort of the savior of the industry, and that was palm oil. Palm oil is a plant-based, largely saturated fat, and it's used in much of the world as a primary cooking oil. Basically, we started importing vast quantities of palm oil, and today, roughly around a third of the palm oil that's produced is produced for foreign consumption, typically in the West. So that's the first issue. That's the first part of this. The problem is, we didn't really think through some pieces of this, and this gets even worse when we get into the 2000s. So in the 2000s, you have more and more pressure coming up over we need to perhaps move away from fossil fuels, some of the rest of this. People are looking for something that's going to save us from climate change. In the 2000s and 2010s, one of the things that came up was, hey, look, palm oil production is super efficient for the amount of land. It is great for things like biodiesel. This is going to save us from climate change. And so, both locally and internationally, demand for palm oil for biodiesels went through the roof. There's one problem here. Nobody stopped to think about the downsides. Palm oil is grown basically in cleared jungle, and so all of the new palm oil production that was basically being driven largely by Western concerns was taking habitat away from orangutans, forest elephants, things like that. Now, many of these were already endangered then. They're even more endangered now. There's critical loss of habitat, and that's largely driven by these particular trends. And the fact is that nobody typically does a full accounting of the environmental costs before we make these kinds of shifts. That's one reason why I personally am very skeptical about lab-grown meat, because I don't think we have anywhere near a full accounting of how lab-grown meat might compare with grass-fed, free-range meat. So this is something which is a recurrent problem in Western society, and this is a problem of our own doing. Nutella uses a lot of palm oil, and the parent company, Ferrero, says, yes, that's true, we use a lot of palm oil, but we get these from sustainable farms. Now, it's very true that when you look at tree crops, they're much more sustainable than a lot of the other crops that might come in and take their place. But that's only half the story, right? The problem here is the total industry and the total consumption. And in this regard, palm oil is very fungible. So every bit of palm oil that we consume could have been used for local energy development projects without clearing more forest land. So while I don't mind if people get a little bit of palm oil for cooking African cuisine or Southeast Asian cuisine, my view is it needs to stay there. We shouldn't be consuming large amounts of palm oil in our processed foods. And so I simply avoid products with that palm oil. In my view, that is an objectively moral issue, and it's something that isn't really apparent when you look at the meme. That's probably not what they had in mind, but it is a serious issue. And so that's the first part. And now I'm going to get into the question of chocolate paired with other things in desserts around the world. Now, having said what I've just said about palm oil and how I think that, for me, use of palm oil in Western manufactured products is a problem that I am quite willing to say I take a moral stand on. I want to go back and I want to talk about the second reaction, which is the aesthetic one. Now, the aesthetic reaction to this meme was, you know, people put Nutella on pizzas here in Europe as sort of a dessert, maybe put fruit on top. There are all kinds of things, you know, you could put it on bread and a lot of the rest of this. So I don't see a problem with putting it on spaghetti. I just think maybe there might need to be some other things like some dried fruits, nuts, that sort of thing. So aesthetically, the idea of Nutella on spaghetti just struck me as incomplete. I just don't like the fact that it's Nutella. So I came up with this idea of a similar kind of dish that would be a really nice and classy dessert. So what it is it's a spaghetti with a chocolate hazelnut sauce, chopped hazelnuts and fruit, and maybe a scoop of ice cream. And that's what we're going to make today. So the ingredients are relatively simple. I have here between 50 and 100 grams of spaghetti, and if you're making it for more, you could simply add more spaghetti and a little more fruit perhaps. I have 4 dried apricots, about 20 or 30 grams of dried cranberries. Dried cherries would probably be really good. Closer to 60 grams of hazelnuts, and around 90 grams of milk chocolate. I used Ritter Sport this time, but you could use another brand. I also have just a couple tablespoons, maybe 3, maybe 4, of milk. This will thin down the chocolate and make it into more of a sauce. And That's basically it for the sauce. I have decided to pair it with this particular salted caramel ice cream. So I'll put a scoop of that on top, but that's totally optional. You could use whipped cream or another kind of ice cream. It'd all be really good. So for the spaghetti water, I'm going to turn this on to high, and instead of salting it, I'm going to very slightly sweeten the water. So I'm just going to dump in a bit of sugar, like a tablespoon or so. And this is there to give the noodles just a little bit of sort of additional oomph. And so we'll go ahead and do that and let that boil. In the meantime, I'm going to start the sauce. Now, to start the sauce, I'm going to turn my pan onto about medium. You definitely don't want it any hotter than that. And I'm going to start by adding my milk and my bunch of the chopped or crushed hazelnuts. I went ahead and crushed them because I like the texture that way better. And I'm going to let these heat a little bit. Once it's starting to kind of steam a little bit, then I'll add the chocolate and I'll start stirring things together. Once the water here is boiling, I'm going to go ahead and kind of slowly push the noodles into them. Now, of course, you could use a lot more water, but then I'd have to use more sugar, so I just decided to use less water. So I'm going to let this soak for a moment, and then I should be able to just kind of gently push this. You could also break the spaghetti, but then it's not going to look as nice when you get done. So just going to gently push these in. So now it's just starting to steam a little bit. That might need just a little more milk. It looks like it's going to, so I'm going to add just a splash more milk. But I'm going to set the chocolate in here. You could use a double boiler, and that might make things a little faster. But I tend to do it on a saucepan on medium with the liquid. Now, when working with chocolate, the reason why a lot of people use a double boiler is that chocolate has a relatively low melting point, and if you heat it up too much, it's going to separate or burn or other kinds of bad things. So if you're doing it directly on a stovetop like this, it's really important to make sure your milk is in first and that you are stirring everything together nicely. All the time. So this is not something you can really walk away from at this point. It would be if you used a double boiler. So maybe that would be something some of you might prefer to do. So I'm going to go ahead and stir this as it melts. Notice it doesn't take very long. You see how fast this stuff is melting. And I think this looks like it might be thin enough. If it's not, then you can add more milk. If it's too thick, you can add more milk. If it's too thin, you can add more chocolate. But we're just going to set it like this, and as soon as everything's melted and stirred together, assuming that I like the consistency, I'm just going to take it off and just let it remain a bit warm. Yeah, this is looking good, so I'm just going to take it off the heat here, and we'll wait for our noodles to be done. So now the noodles are al dente. They have a really interesting subtle flavor because of the sugar. I'm going to strain them and put them under cold water briefly, so that they stop cooking and cool down before I mix them with the sauce. So here I have the noodles strained, cooled down. They were under cold water briefly. I've let them sit a little bit to partially dry out, and now I'm going to scoop on some sauce. So from here, things move relatively fast. I'm going to scoop on some sauce. I'm going to toss them with a fork to mix it together really well, and then I will start plating. So here we are, some sauce. And everything here is a bit warm, but it's not like hot. This will also become important when we start mixing it with the ice cream. And basically, I'm going to keep adding sauce and keep stirring it together until we have everything kind of a nice uniform coating of the sauce. One issue of living near a hospital, a police station and fire department are the number of sirens. Alright, I think we are almost done. I'm going to add just a little more and see if that changes anything. And as you can see, this is probably enough sauce for twice this much noodles, but that's fine. Who doesn't like chocolate hazelnut sauce that you can put on just about anything, including ice cream? So here we are. Yep, I think that's about what we're going to get. So, to plate, as always, the best instrument for this are tongs. And we're just going to go ahead, put everything up. I usually twirl the first bit and and then I twirl it all together. The reason for that is that otherwise it's hard to kind of maintain shape. There we go. Now we're going to garnish it, add the ice cream, and top it over with whatever sauce is left here. So first, I have chopped these dried apricots. I've left the cranberries whole, and I'm just going to put some of these around on top. And I have some more of the hazelnuts that I've finely chopped in a food processor, or similar, in this case a hand blender, with a kind of a chopping attachment. Put those on top. And then once I have however much I want, then we'll go ahead and do the ice cream. We have a scoop of ice cream. We'll just set this right in the middle like that. And then drizzle the remaining sauce. And maybe garnish the plate a little bit with it. And here we have chocolate hazelnut spaghetti with dried fruit and ice cream. And now for the taste test. I'm going to use a fork, even with the ice cream. I love how the chocolate and hazelnuts gives the ice cream just a little bit more depth. Now try it with a nice scoop of chocolate spaghetti. I really can't describe how delicious this is in combination. All you have to try it. It's really amazing. I just have no words beyond that. It's delicious. So anyway, thank all of you for watching. Hope you have a great week. See you next week. Thanks and bon appetit.